So if we move to the next slide, what I'd like to talk briefly about is just some of those guidelines that we have as clinicians as far as what recommendations we have available or published for our patient populations where we want to recommend these types of fibers, whether it's insoluble fiber, soluble fiber, or a combination of both. And of course, we have the newer released dietary recommended intakes, the DRIs, and now we have the recommendations for certain genders, so we have different recommendations for male versus female, as well as age. And I just wanted to share an example with you on this slide. For example, the male that's less than 50 years of age, the recommendation for total fiber would be 38 grams a day. And then for those individuals over 50 years of age, the consensus was 30 grams per day. So again, the thought here is that as we age, we tend to eat less, so we don't get in as many calories or necessarily need as many calories, and therefore would take in less fiber. Another published recommendation that we have available to us is the American Dietetic Association's position paper, and that was published in '97, and the recommendations for fiber, again, total fiber intake, was 20 to 35 grams per day. So again, it's going to be somewhat similar to the DRIs as far as what would be safe and effective in adding fiber to the diets. And then from a pediatric standpoint, we do have published guidelines from the American Academy of Pediatrics. And the recommendations here are to take the child's age and add 5 grams, and that would provide the total recommended fiber per day. And this is actually intended for children that are above the age of 2. And at this point, there is no published data or recommendations that would support or recommend an exact amount for children under the age of 2. So that's really what we have available is maybe consumption data, knowing what the average amount of fiber intake might be. Which leads us to our next slide, and that is, what is the average reported fiber intake in the daily diet here? And what we have available, for example, the NHANES data, which is a survey looking at what average intake of fiber would be included in the diet, we find that the average is only literally almost 12.5 grams per day. So obviously we can see that there is approximately 50% of what's being recommended actually being consumed by the adult individual. So, you know, it's easier said than done, I think, when we try to incorporate a lot of high-fiber foods, and with the Western diet the way it is today, it can be more challenging to try to get to those higher levels. And certainly, going back to the cartoon, when we think about the general patient population, they will tend to think about fiber and how it does have this role on bowel management, and sometimes they may not think it's as beneficial as we would all like it to be. Also, there is some data that reports how much inulin and fructooligosaccharides are taken in, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time discussing inulin and FOS in just a moment. And the average intake, just to share with you, is approximately about 2.5 grams per day of inulin and about 2.5 grams per day of fructooligosaccharides, or FOS for short. And then in regards to adverse effects, I just wanted to make a comment that in regards to these more particular soluble short-chain fibers, there haven't been any adverse effects reported. But when we think about total fiber intake, one of the studies that we have available to us today, the majority of them, there might be some issues with the insoluble fibers binding with some of the minerals, making them less bioavailable. But again, that data has been supportive with insoluble fibers and not the prebiotics that we're going to be focusing on today. And then the other area that is mentioned in the literature is that if you were to go too high with the high fiber diet for the very young individual with a child, sometimes that interferes with them getting in enough calories overall. So just wanted to share some of those points with you in regards to potentially adverse effects in regards to total fiber intake. So now what I'd like to focus on for the remainder of the lecture would be the prebiotics specifically, and then we'll talk about probiotics. And this next slide, which is titled Fiber Fermentation, is a very key slide because this is what we're going to focus on for the rest of the lecture, and that is when bacteria hydrolyzes or breaks down these unique short-chain soluble fibers, there are some compounds that are released that seem to exert an additional beneficial effect for the host. And those byproducts would include lactic acid, short-chain fatty acids. And the most commonly researched and what we have data available on today would include acetate, propionate, and butyrate. So those are the three key short-chain fatty acids that we're going to be focusing on today. And then last but of course not least would be the release of gas. And this is where we have maybe those less desirable effects that we see following the fermentation of these short-chain soluble fibers. And that's where we have the release of hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and methane. Now the next slide is an illustration, and this illustration is just to further support what's happening during the fermentation process. So as you can see within the colonic mucosa, we have this interaction between, again, already existing good bacteria, if you will, that breaks down these fermentable fibers, releasing those short-chain fatty acids, releasing lactic acid, and those gases. And you'll see that there is a dotted line for butyrate. Now, butyrate actually is more of the preferred short-chain fatty acid by those colonocytes. And those colonocytes actually use butyrate for energy, whereas the acetate and propionate tend to pass through the brush border and actually are then carried on into circulation and processed by the liver accordingly. And then when we address the gases are excreted either through your breath or through flatulence or in the stool. So that's basically the nuts and bolts of the fermentation process. It's really not an elaborate process, but the outcomes from this fermentation process, the potential benefits are quite extreme. So on the next slide, what are the main effects from the release of these short-chain fatty acids? And just to highlight some of the areas that continue to receive a lot of research, supporting the use of short-chain fatty acids is the fact that we see an increase in bacterial mass. And what that means is by providing these fuel sources, if you will, to the bacteria that's already existing, it allows them to proliferate. We also find that these short-chain fatty acids, again, feed the mucosa within the colon, so they provide a readily available energy source. The stimulation of sodium and chloride as well as water absorption is enhanced. As these short-chain fatty acids are absorbed within the brush border, we also pull in sodium chloride as well as water. So that's another key role, especially when we start talking about the benefits of prebiotics for patients that are suffering from diarrhea. We also see that there is an increase in mucosal blood flow. Again, you are providing a trophic effect, if you will, to those tissues lining the GI tract. We've also identified that there is a stimulation of mucin production, and that's always good from a protective effect. And then we've also identified that there is a decrease in the colonic pH. And this occurs because when the fermentation process occurs and you release those compounds, that lactic acid actually is very acidic. And what it does is it lowers the pH, so it alters the environment within the colon.